Hey guys, before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone that this retrospective and every damn video I make are all thanks to my backers on Patreon. The names you see scrolling by are the reason I'm able to deliver this content on the semi-frequent basis I've been able to keep up. As some of you may know, it's getting easier for large corporations to bring the hammer down even when the content in question falls well within the bounds of fair use, as I've learned with my recent run-in with Sony Pictures. They hit my review of Resident Evil Degeneration with a copyright claim, and YouTube in their infinite wisdom has given the party making the claim the right to decide whether or not a video is transformative work, which is like giving a fox the keys to the henhouse, only the henhouse is my livelihood. Regardless, I will continue to review the Resident Evil movies. I told you guys I was going to do it, and I'll be damned if more of these strikes are going to stop me. So if you're watching this and you'd like to see the channel grow, feel free to follow the link in the corner or down in the description. $1 a month doesn't seem like a lot, but to small content creators like myself, it can make a whole world of difference. If you can't or don't want to get involved with Patreon, I completely understand. Support or not, I appreciate your time, and I'm thankful just to have you watching this video today. So with all the boring stuff out of the way, let's get down to business. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are already 2 entries deep in this retrospective, so I thought it would be nice to take a look back on what we've learned so far. Sound like a plan? Alright, so Dino Crisis, dope survival horror game trying to outdo the big boys in the genre. Dino Crisis 2, an arcade action marathon that killed a survival horror game and is now walking around in its skin. So where could we possibly go from here? Well, if you guessed in the most batshit insane direction imaginable, you are absolutely correct. The next game in the Dino Crisis series is actually an entry in the Gun Survivor line of games, an offshoot of Resident Evil. Man, talking about going full circle. The first DC game was essentially made to make up for RE's shortcomings, and here we are with the series being folded into a spin-off franchise under the Resident Evil umbrella. Pun intended. It may not have made any earthly sense to take Dino Crisis and turn it into a first-person light gun shooter, but PS2-era Capcom wasn't exactly interested in making a whole lot of sense. Well, as your tour guide through this mind-boggling franchise, it's my job to answer one question. Despite the headache-inducing lineage, is this a game worthy of sitting in your PS2 collection? Well, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to the Dino Crisis Retrospective. So typically I start these things with a quick look at how the game was developed and maybe what was going through the minds of the devs when it was being worked on. But Dino Stalker's development may as well be a closely guarded government secret because I'm not finding any info on it. Typically I'd make some educated guesses here, but for the life of me, I can't imagine what drove Capcom to take a middling franchise like Dino Crisis and slot it into a series of Resident Evil themed first-person shooters. At least with the last entry of this specific franchise, they had the justification of some arcade revenue, but to my surprise, Gun Survivor 3 never got an arcade release. Of course, this period of the PS2 era saw a heap of low-effort, low-budget games hitting the market, but even though Dino Stalker is a bit rough around the edges, it was leagues ahead of Gun Survivor 2. Well, I guess I'll never understand what the hell drove them to make this thing, which I think is a fitting segue into the story.
I'm still a soldier. I will do my best to save my people, my world.
Okay, so if you thought this game's tacit affiliation with Resident Evil was a bit confusing, get ready for some real nonsense. And before we get into this, I should probably mention that we'll be spoiling the endings of both Dino Crisis games here, so follow the timestamp on screen to avoid any of that. Alright, so as we know it, the end of DC-1 saw a time rift wreaking havoc with the past, and the ending of Part 2 had our heroes finding out that the government saw this damage could lead to both the dinosaurs and humans just never existing. So they did the only logical thing one could think of and sent all the dinosaurs 3 million years into the future until this whole tear in the space-time continuum thing just passed over. Are you keeping up so far? Well, you definitely shouldn't be. This plot is fucking insane, but we're not done yet. Dino Stalker starts off with our main character dogfighting over the Atlantic in the 1940s when he's suddenly snatched out of death's grasp and sent into our little future fun zone, where a voice coming from his brand new flossed out wrist communicator tells him to find Paula, Dylan's future daughter from the past, and no, you didn't hear that wrong. Once the two actually meet up, we find out that Dylan has been calling the shots this whole time, and that the computer who should be looking after the dinosaurs is malfunctioning, and they're apparently stuck in hyperspace. Trust me, it gets more insane from here.
How convenient for you! You get to sit back and watch while we fight for our lives!
Now, those of you who haven't passed out from trying to make sense of this might be saying something along the lines of, "This is the most convoluted story I've ever heard," and you know what? You're right. Being a more action-focused game, there isn't a lot of story to go around, but it's spread out pretty well. Most levels end with some kind of cutscene progressing things forward, and if you love Capcom's special brand of bad voice acting, you'll have an absolute blast with this one.
Mike!
There's no time. Do it, Paula.
Overall, I guess I can't be too hard on Dino Stalker. Sure, it has a complicated system of sci-fi craziness in place of an actual plot, but they certainly didn't have to go through the trouble of making all this up. They could have just said, here's a gun, there's some dinosaurs, now go make oil out of them. Instead, they took Dino Crisis 2's ridiculous ending and made it seem simple and easy to digest by comparison, and I think part of me might appreciate that. The good news is this 100% falls under the so bad it's good umbrella, so if you're not a fan of taking seriously a story about a World War II pilot shooting rocket launchers at velociraptors, you can always bask in the bad writing and even worse voice work. Aside from that, I'm pretty blown away that this spin-off was given a story so entangled in the main Dino Crisis timeline. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but I kinda like that. Obviously, you shouldn't be playing these games for their thrilling narratives, but I guess it's better than nothing, or at the very least, much better than Gun Survivor 2.
Snipe shot.
Before we talk about gameplay real deep, we definitely have to get this out of the way right up front. This is indeed a light gun shooter, and no, I am not playing it with a light gun. I use an upscaler to record my gameplay footage, and this means using an LCD, which is like kryptonite to light guns. I can admit this means I may be missing out on the real way to play the game, but based on the reviews I've read from when Dino Stalker released, a lot of people seem to think a controller was preferable. So take this entire section with a giant grain of salt. Oh, and yeah, we're playing the Japanese version because I found it for $2 or $3 in Tokyo, and oh, why the hell not? And now that that's out of the way, I can say Dino Stalker did not make a good first impression on me. Using a controller, the layout is not exactly the standard first-person experience. You have to use the left analog stick to move backwards and forwards and strafe left to right, which is pretty run-of-the-mill, but the right analog stick is where things get a little odd. In your average FPS, your character's head is controlled by either a mouse or a stick, and an aiming reticle is slapped in the middle of the screen. So when you want to shoot at something, you only have to center it on your screen. In this game, the horizontal axis of the right analog stick shifts your view, but up and down controls your reticle and not your head. Kind of like the reticle exists independently, which really messed with my brain. At first, I was ready to put the game down and write up a frustrated rant on why Capcom can't just use regular controls instead of keeping the awkward style they use in the Gun Survivor games. But I gave it another shot, and I'm happy to say it's totally possible to adapt to the controls and have a great time with this one. I found that touching the right analog stick as little as possible was the key here. As soon as I would load into an area, I would adjust the reticle just a bit lower than center, since most dinosaurs you'll fight are a bit shorter than you. Then I would exclusively use the left stick to get around, and even though this meant being a little less accurate than I would like, it worked perfectly. Every so often, mostly in boss battles, I would need to adjust the height of the reticle, but 90% of the time it was a set it and forget it type of deal. After this revelation, I started actually having a lot of fun. The action was pretty fast-paced, and aside from a few areas in the first level being kind of easy to get lost in, I was having a great time. Controls aside, the general idea here is to get from point A to point B, kinda like a rail shooter, only in true Gun Survivor fashion, you also have control over your own legs. You're constantly working against a timer, and thanks to a buttload of destructible environmental objects, you'll be able to find these little crystals to help add time to the counter, and special weapons, which you can switch to with the circle button. These weapons are cool as hell, but they have limited ammo, and sometimes the old survival horror fan in me came out, and I ended up conserving these guns even when it would have been much smarter just to use them. There's an okay variety of enemies on offer here, and the boss fights can actually be really entertaining. At the end of each area, you're graded on your performance, but without a light gun, don't expect to be getting a bonus for killing every dinosaur in the level. Even though this game is perfectly playable with a controller, you just don't have the accuracy and speed required to kill them all, or maybe I just didn't. Well, I'm man enough to admit I was ready to give up on this one at first. The controls are incredibly unintuitive your first time around, but you'll start to either work with them or against them eventually. Either way, there's actually a pretty fun game to play here. Sure, it's no substantial entry in the Dino Crisis series, but it's a dumb, enjoyable shooter that doesn't take very long to beat, and might be even more of a blast if you have the equipment required to play it the way the devs intended. Is it a must-play? No, definitely not. I'm sure no one's missing out by not getting their hands on it immediately, but if you find it for a bit under the current price of about 12 bucks, I'd say go for it. I mean, even if you end up hating it, you could always just pull it out to show off to that one hipster nerd that hangs out with you that thinks obscure games are really cool. You know we all have one of those friends. Honestly, I'm not sure what I can even say here. Dino Stalker is a relatively low-budget PS2 game, and it looks exactly what just came to your mind when I said that. The heads-up display is pleasing enough, and the game is bright and colorful to the point that it can sometimes accidentally look pretty impressive. Pulling from its arcade shooter lineage, each connecting hit has a satisfying and flashy effect, and the special weapons all have a really interesting variety in how they look and feel to fire. The dinosaurs all look okay, I guess, and can we please take a second to appreciate the fact that the game hypes up this one super intelligent dino that was supposed to act as a middleman between the supercomputer and the rest of the animals, and then he ends up being this small little pissant that poses no threat whatsoever. If you like a good low-effort sci-fi film, you'll love laughing at the awkward cutscenes and hilarious writing, but I will say these CGs are way less compressed than your typical PS2 DVD, which I assume is thanks to this not being too large of a game to begin with. On a more positive note, the game keeps its frame rate relatively smooth. There are a few instances of slowdown, but not a lot that I noticed. For those of you planning on upscaling Dino Stalker, do be aware of the pitfalls of upconverting interlaced video. Even though most don't like the FrameMeister's handling of 480i, I think it looks great. Of course, converting that signal to a progressive format is a must, and this is where the divide gets drawn. Using the FrameMeister's adaptive deinterlacing does give the image just the slightest blur when it's in motion, which might be a deal breaker for some, but for me the alternative is much worse. Using a line doubler like the OSSC might give you a sharper overall image, if only marginally, but you'll be stuck with bob deinterlacing, which just does not look right for me. Something about this bouncy look on a modern TV just doesn't look natural. You've been looking at the FrameMeister's adaptive approach throughout this video, so maybe use this as an opportunity to preview what you might get into when and if you decide to fall into the rabbit hole that is retro video upconversion. Other than that, I really don't have too much to say here. Dino Stalker doesn't exactly look good, but it doesn't look half bad either. There are no ports to compare, and the game just lacks any interesting factoids having to do with video output. I'll be honest, I kind of feel weird not boring half of you guys to sleep with my normal rants on shit that no one cares about. Huh. Is this what being entertaining feels like?
Are you the final enemy? Come on! I'm sending your prehistoric butt back where it belongs.
And there we have it. Dino Stalker is an odd little game that's a bit more fun than it probably has any right to be, but definitely not what I would call a true Dino Crisis game. Although at this point it's getting pretty hard to classify exactly what that is. Is it a slow-paced atmospheric survival horror game or an action-packed tank controls driven shooter? Well, we're not exactly finished yet, so there's no point in speculating. We still have one more entry left in this retrospective, and hey, who knows, maybe Dino Crisis 3 will settle the debate once and for all. Or maybe it'll be a huge disappointment that I'll dread having to finish. Either way, thanks for watching guys, and hopefully I'll see all of you again right here on the Dino Crisis Retrospective. Hey, thanks for stopping by guys. If you fancy a bit more dinosaur-based goodness, I have the rest of the Dino Crisis videos linked here on screen, and maybe think about checking out my Patreon to support whatever the hell I end up getting into next. Well, that's it for now, so here's hoping you have a good day, and I'll see all of you next time.